Hello, and welcome back to our survey of church history, the church's story. Last week, we introduced the period of earliest Christianity from the New Testament to 311, and we focused on even the first half of that period, the sub apostolic church, the period from the New Testament to about 140. So who remembers how do we know about the church in the generation after the apostles?
We have fragmented writings and letters that are not part of the Bible, but we have them.
Yeah, they're writings from this period. Some of them we know about and they're lost and we only have fragments of, but we have quite a few entire documents, letters from these people. Tonight, Dr. Stanglin, I think, mentions Ignatius, and we have 7 letters for him when he was on his way to be tried and presumably executed. And so we have letters from him. We have something called the Didache, which was it was maybe the earliest piece. And it was sort of an overview called Didache means teaching. And so it was the teaching of the apostles is the full title. And that's the piece that was suggested reading for follow up from last week. So, if you read the Didache, then what did you notice? What stood out to you, or what did you think it was about? Any comments on that?
I would just say a lot of it was very similar to stuff. I mean, that was in the Bible. Like a lot of it seemed to be just quoting straight from the Bible.
Yeah, and particularly what part of the Bible?
The New Testament from
Yeah,
Jesus' words. Yeah.
Jesus' word. It really seemed very much echoing of the Sermon on the Mount, didn't
Yes.
it?
Yeah.
We heard
But,
a
but then
lot of
there were,
repetition.
yes, but then there were some additions in there. Some, practical, like what do you do if you're living out in the desert and you want to be baptized? Well, there's no streams of running water, so what do you do? That kind of thing. So, and some of it was a little bit just adding on more than what Jesus said. So it was on the same theme of the things that Jesus said, but maybe not straight from the New Testament.
Yeah, and it talked about the gospel. And I think, but this would have been in a period while our 4 gospels were still being written. So all of these writings were drawing on this same kind of body of ideas of these were the teachings of our Lord, and we know them from the apostles, and now we're writing them down. Yeah. What else? What else struck you?
I thought it was very interesting that there were several comments about magic. Like,
Oh, right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And why do you suppose?
Well, I mean, I think it was because the, the Christians were performing miracles. And there was that feeling that they were somehow using sorcery to do this. And I think that they wanted to differentiate themselves as a community, and kind of definitely separate themselves from this idea that they were engaging in sorcery and other things like that.
Witchcraft and divination, right? So we get a story like that in scripture where Paul's been performing miracles, and so they start worshiping him as a god, and when he isn't, when they say he's not a god, then they're going to lynch him, right? Like it's an issue, especially in the Gentile community. So when Jesus is teaching the Sermon on the Mount, he's speaking to a Jewish audience who would never have participated in divination or witchcraft. But then, as the word goes out to the wider world and to Gentile communities, you have very commonly practices of witchcraft, divination, sorcery that are common. And so this teaching speaks to that, saying don't have anything to do with it. And that is one of the, Paige mentioned, but there's some additions, and that's one of them that applies to the wider audience. Yeah, what a good point.
I was also curious about the part where we were told, or the leaders were told, to pray the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day. That was very interesting and
Yeah,
specific.
I agree. I have always wondered if did Jesus really mean for people to recite this prayer, or did he
Yeah.
just mean it as a kind of prayer, and kind of wondered about that? But here we have this very early work where they're not only reciting it, but they have like a prescription, say this 3 times a day. And so this must have been a way to train the mind in prayer and train towards a habit of prayer and bring these people who are new to the practice of worship of the one God into a prayerful heart and a prayerful attitude. Yeah, that was very interesting. Any other? I have a couple of things I noticed. That when they talk about the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, they put the cup first and the bread second. And, we've always done the bread first. And so I thought that was interesting. But even in the Gospel of Luke, we get a order of cup, bread, cup that is there's that element was interesting. And then it specifies the communion is for baptized believers. It says that as, part of the practice of the early church is that this is the rule. Another thing I thought was very noticeable is how much time they spent on guarding against false prophets or false teachers. Right? There's a lot of content about how you need to be hospitable towards prophets, teachers, and apostles that might come by. So this is still during the time of apostles, right? But make sure they're not false prophets or false apostles. And they gave some guidelines. If they ask for money, false apostle. So that was very interesting. And so we're going to keep that in mind, because not in this week's video, but the next, we talk about the church's focus on keeping the teaching correct, keeping the correct orthodoxy of the church intact, and guarding against false teaching. And so that will be in 2 weeks. And this document really does focus on that, as does the New Testament, which we'll see. And then this ends with a encouragement towards faithfulness, which is very New Testament like. Well, any other comments on the Didache? This is something that I think is worth reading. If you haven't, it's definitely worth hitting that link and going back. And it's not super long. And just seeing how Christians at this very early stage were thinking about the faith. I got one more comment offline, was that, wow, they were really strict. And they were very intent on the idea of focusing on holiness and on the importance of really following those teachings. That idea that, oh, the Sermon on the Mount is just, the ideal that we're never going to lift up to. That was not how they took it. They were really intent to follow those teachings. Well, this week, Dr. Stanglin is again going to cover earliest Christianity, and this time he's going to focus on the interactions between the church and Roman society and the problems in those interactions, how pagans viewed Christians, what some of their accusations towards Christians were, and how that led to persecution and some important periods of persecution. And though this won't cover nearly all of the persecutions that happened during this time, it will kind of give you a flavor for it. And this is one of the longest videos, so we may not have a ton of time for discussion afterwards. But if you are watching this after the fact, this is the time to go to the Christian Studies website and watch the video for Module 3. And I am going to pause the recorder and play our video. Okay, what did y'all think of this description of persecution in the period of earliest church? Anything jump out at you?
A lot of it is kind of the reverse of what humans are concerned, or humans, Christians are concerned about today towards the pagans. It's flip-flopped.
Right, being called atheist is kind of it's such a backwards way to our thinking, isn't it? Yeah. And the idea of like incest, like because they were very concerned even then with sexual purity, and then you see this accusation of sexual perversion, and so yeah, you have a lot of things like that. What else?
Well, there was what was it? The child abuse stuff, when you have gods that they're sacrificing their own children to.
So
Earlier, I guess, not at this.
right, in this, yeah, in this period you don't get sacrificing of children to the gods, but one thing that is very common in pagan society is to abandon an infant to die in the elements. If they have any kind of defect, then they would just be left on the city wall to, you know, just starve. And it's in this period that Christians begin um, collecting those babies and raising them, rescuing them, because they value that. And so this idea that they would be cannibals of babies is the reverse of their actual behavior. And we have writers from this period. Justin Martyr is one who writes to Roman audience, detailing each one of these accusations and speaking to it and explaining why that isn't who they are. So that's very interesting. Anything else jump out?
I found it really kind of strange that Christians were compared to the Bacchae. Bacchanals and a Christian service are so not the same.
Right. One is very debauch. It's about debauchery, right? And the other one is not, but it seems that people didn't know that. And they were both considered to be insular, secretive, and if they're secretive, it's because they're being persecuted, and, so yeah. But they were equally under suspicion in Roman society. Yeah.
And what did the Christians think about this persecution? That question was like, what?
Okay, say more about that. What do we assume they thought about it?
I just like when his question just kind of took me back when he asked that. But Christians apparently, I mean, even from the quote, apparently at the time, some Christians, were glad for it because it grew their numbers. But, I can't imagine your day-to-day normal Christian person thinking, oh, I hope there's persecution this year. But
so, I mean, even I believe that was Tertullian that he quoted. Even, all of those people were praying desperately for the relief and praying for the end of these persecutions. And yet they couldn't help but acknowledge the good that came out of it secondarily, even though they knew, primarily this is a very bad thing to experience. And they themselves knew, because they were under suspicion often, and under persecution themselves. Wasn't about somebody else over there. And it's easy to say how God makes good come out of evil situations because I'm not living it. They were, these were the people who were living it. So, let's read our passages from First Peter, so that we make sure we get in our Bible reading. So First Peter 2, 9 through 12 is the first of those passages. Does anyone have that? I'll read it since I haven't been talking.
I can do it.
Oh, you will? Good.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. 2, 9 through 12, right? But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they may accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us.
Thank you. Okay, so we see in that one that there is this connection between who you are as a Christian. What is your identity? You have this strong identity as people chosen by God, called by God to live in a certain way. And I think sometimes when we refer to the pagans, people will use that term to just mean irreligious people, but these were people who were they had the pagan religion, right? This was the majority of the world were practicing pagans, and this idea that they could, by their exemplary lives, make a difference. And this did, in fact, happen over the course of this period. Christianity began to grow more and more until it is expanding like wildfire by the end of this period. Okay, let's read 1 Peter 4, 1 through 4, please.
I can read that.
Thanks.
You said 1 Peter 4, 1 through what?
4.
Okay. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you.
Thank you. Okay, so can we get a sense of what differences between the Christians and the pagans made people so suspicious of them? What did you hear from the video, or what do you hear from this passage?
Something that struck me was that the the Romans who called them atheists because they didn't, worship the gods. It was like no one in that society did not have a religion. Everyone was religious, and that's just not what we encounter now. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around the idea that every single person had a way of living their lives according to a philosophy that had to do with gods, higher powers. So I think I was kind of having trouble thinking through that the whole time he was talking, because I was like, wow, well, I mean, most of the people I know are really humanists, basically that the highest good can be in loving yourself, which there's a lot of good in loving yourself, obviously. But so sorry, what was the question? Because I had a tie in there. You said,
So the idea is like, what were they so suspicious of? And I think you've really hit on something, because their lives and their physical environment were completely saturated with shrines. Like every door you go in has a little thing to sacrifice, to honor whatever god you're going
we
in.
seemed non-religious to them.
Right. And so to not participate, and most of what the society would do is if there was something new, they would combine it, add it into what they already had and participate in more. It was just more, more, more. So to strip all of that away from your practice leaves you totally antisocial. Every festival, every athletic competition, every single thing is dedicated to the gods. And so trying to navigate that society without participating in that is kind of a minefield that they were walking, and it made them look very strange. And we also think about, we all know there's stories in the New Testament, and also just from, like, if you know Greek stories, the city is protected by its patron god or goddess, right? And they could relied on the entire community participating together to keep that god happy enough that our city will be okay, that our crops will be okay, that our people will be fertile, that our trades will work out, that we won't be struck by plague. And so if you are not participating in that, there's a sense that, like, well, you could bring disaster on all of us. And so their lack of participation was not just an absence, it was something that was seen as actively detrimental to the community. And I think we're seeing that reversal that you mentioned again, in the sense that, like, we think of Christian practice as very pro community, community minded, family minded, and this would have seemed the opposite. Yeah. Well, I
Well,
think we heard. Go ahead.
April kind of said something that hit a chord with me, though, too, with the humanist thing. When you read, the list of all these things that they're doing, it's almost like the structure of all of these pagan festivals, gods, prayers, it's to serve themselves. It's serving the flesh, all the orgies, the drunkenness, the parties, all this kind of stuff. Yes, it's not like the inner humanist contemplation kind of thing, but I mean, it's all really just to entertain yourself,
And much of the different pagan worships would involve um, sexual acts as part of, like, fertility, seeking fertility. And so, those were all tied together.
Yeah.
All of that, all of those orgies and all of that is tied in to a sense of what we're doing for worship. And you're like, well, that's convenient. And maybe good point, but there's for them to try to extricate themselves from that entire fabric was very challenging.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, what did you think of the letters between Pliny and Trajan, the governor who was like, I didn't know what to do, so I executed some. What do you think?
Mhm.
Yeah, it's life is taken lightly, especially the lives of the people who don't matter. And at one point he said, well, I had two female slaves, and they were just slaves, and they were supposed to be Christians, so I tortured them a while. But I only found out that they just eat innocent food. They're not eating babies at all. There's a sense that, like, there's no cost to me for torturing these people because these people have no value. Anything else strike you about Pliny and Trajan? That is a short piece. I can't remember if it prints on one page or on front and back of a page, but there is a link in your handout if you want to read the whole thing. Although Dr. Stenglen really he quoted the majority of it. The meat of it was in his quotation. So you got all the good parts there. So feel free to link through and read that. But the reading that I'm highlighting this week is the second reading in the handout that Dr. Strangland offers, and it is one of the letters from St. Ignatius. Now, he just mentioned this briefly. Ignatius was martyred during this period. It was under Trajan. But he was the person who wrote the 7 letters while he was being transferred. And he was on the road to Rome where his trial and execution would take place when he writes these letters. And one of his letters is to Christians in Rome. So he's sending ahead a letter to where he's going to be when he expects to be tried and executed. And if you'll go ahead and read that, it's not long. It's like I think 4 pages when you print it out in like a reader friendly version. Look for what he thinks his execution will consist of. What does he think is going to happen to him himself when he gets there? And look for what his main request from the people of Rome is, because it's really quite interesting. And we will try and talk about that at the beginning of next week's lesson. Well, we'll see. So this will kind of all tie together. That at the very end, when he was talking about that final great persecution, did you catch what the motivating reason was for Diocletian to decide to persecute Christians during that period?
I put unifying the Roman Empire.
Yes. So Diocletian is struggling. The Roman Empire has been declining since about 180, and Diocletian divided it into East and West in 286 in hopes to stabilize it. They've got a bunch of border wars. They've got revolts in outlying provinces. They've got taxation problems, trouble with financial and administrative issues. And it's too big. They can't manage it. Pressure from all sides, and they're trying to figure out what to do. And he wanted to use worship of the Roman gods to try and worship of the emperor, right? Like that's him, right? So there's some ego in here to bring everyone together. But guess who wouldn't fall in line? The Christians, of course. So he decided, like, well, we can up worship of Roman gods and worship of me, and down the Christians by you will give everybody a common thing to worship and a common enemy at the same time by persecuting Christians. And so it was a concerted effort, and you heard about the property confiscations and the tortures and everyone was like, all civil rights of all Christians were suspended. That he wanted to use, that he was going to get the Roman Empire back together. And this does not work out very well for him because of this very effect that Christianity is going up and up and up and up, and it's spreading. And this takes us all the way to the end of the period and kind of sets up what will happen next. Okay, so next lesson, we're going to go back and look at how Christians dealt with false teaching and how they dealt with specifying more clearly what the Christian doctrine is. What exactly did the apostles teach? And when this person asks a question, answering it helps clarify. And so we're going to talk about that next week. And then we'll be right on the cusp of a major sea change for how Christianity functions in the Roman Empire starting after 311. And we'll pick that up for the following lesson. Well, next week is a service week for Tuesday morning. And so we have a break in our schedule next week. So it will be 2 weeks, and then we'll do the lesson, Trouble from Within, Heresy. Thanks, everybody, for a great discussion today, and we'll look forward to next time.